Hi there, this is Ian Wright, and this is it's really, I suppose, the first of a series of podcasts around self-care. And it's designed, I suppose, partly for my colleagues who I'm teaching, and it's a part of what we do as practitioners. When we're teaching this, we tend to not think about self-care, but it can be applied to everybody. And there are various threads and elements I want to bring in, so it'll be a series of things, and I hope it's helpful. This one is more of a kind of introduction, and I'm going to use the metaphor of a car, actually, in how we should self-care and work with ourselves. I'm going to do other ones, I think, on developing practices, sleep, nutrition, exercise, choosing the right exercise process for us, and one on kind of emotional, spiritual regulation, I think. And hopefully that combination of things may prove helpful to whoever may be listening. So one of the old founders of osteopathy, called William Gardner Sutherland, when he was developing some of his principles, it was in the 1920s, the 1930s, slightly before that, but at that time, automobiles in America were the excitement. They were developing fast and everybody wanted one. And he used metaphor of a car for the body, the engine mechanics of the body. And I just want to, I suppose, pick that up a little bit in a couple of thoughts and ideas about self-care, slightly from possibly a Taoist perspective as well. So we've got, just to cut it into basics, we have our mind, our brain. Our mind, let's think about, which is something that we could say interprets the environment around us. It creates an image. So we have our senses, which interpret the environment, take in the environment. Our mind turns that into a reality, a filter, but it filters through it our beliefs, our emotions, our thinkings. So we have these filters onto these images which create the way we perceive the world. And then the world is perceived by our body, and our body acts within the world. So I think there are various things that we'll talk about allowing our senses to kind of return to us, so that our senses aren't everywhere and we're not in a constant sense of overwhelm. But I'll talk about that more another time. So we live, of course, through this sensory overload, which I often talk about, in a state of constant low-grade anxiety. Our nervous systems are heightened in their reactivity. We're taking in a million different senses, and our speed of interpretation of this, I think all of us is getting very fast. I often look at people who are a ripe old age, my parents, etc., who are using these pieces of equipment, these phones, smartphones, etc., and they're using them so fast. And then I look at children very, very young, 4 or 5 months, who are using this and interpreting information. My children interpret such a great degree of information at such a speed. My son has a computer and he's got 2 or 3 screens up at once, and he's working on 2 or 3 things at once. That sense of that speed of interpretation is incredible, but surprisingly, he finds it difficult to get to sleep sometimes, because we're overwhelmed. So what happens is, when our senses are stimulated, it stimulates our nervous system to react, and parts of our nervous system, like the sympathetic nervous system, which puts out things like adrenaline and norepinephrine, go into superdrive. Also, when our body is under what is perceived distress, we pump out things like cortisol, which are stress hormones. Now, the problem is we're living in this world where there's a low level or a high level of stress. So our bodies are acting like we are being chased by a wild animal, but all the time. So our physiology is in that state. It has no time to pause, to idle, to find itself neutral. So taking that car metaphor, I think that there's two really important things for me. One is that we should never be revving our gears. Let's take a geared car. You know when a car is in its perfect kind of harmony and the revs drop to say 1,500, and you kind of slip into fourth, but you're not going that fast. You're say going 40 miles an hour, but you're in fourth or fifth gear, and the engine just drops down and it's purring comfortably. And it's almost like it's resting. It feels very comfortable. Or if you've ever driven an electric car, and it's beautiful, as it pulls away, it's like it's effortless. There's no energy. It feels like there's no, because it's electric, it feels like it's effortless and it glides away. So when the engine is kind of in this glide mode, where we're not putting effort in, it's like when I'm going running, I try to keep in the sort of semi-effortless state. It's hard on hills, but just not putting too much revs in. It's like, I suppose if you expand this metaphor, is if you rev a car very hard, you over-rev it, it tires out. And our bodies actually are very physical, and they do tire out, and they need care and attention and oil and water and feeding and rest and all those kinds of things, but we forget to do those basic things. So the first thing I think that we want to take is to approach life in a very gentle gear. Everything slightly slower. We don't have to rev to get to top speed. We just slowly engage through the gears, keep everything light. When you're driving and it's just so, and you're driving in the country, it's beautiful, and you drive specifically slowly. You're slower than you would on a normal day because, say, it's a Sunday and it's a beautiful day, the sun's out, and you're just driving gently, and it's so calm. And I think my mother used to say to me, "Please, Ian, drive like you're driving the Queen." Maybe I would drive too fast. But that kind of sense of driving very, very calmly, consciously almost, which takes that revving off. And I think we can apply that metaphor to everyday life if we're just doing the hoovering or dropping the kids off, or whatever we're doing, or going through our daily work. If we can go into some sort of gentle, rhythmic fluid where actually our nervous systems aren't in this state of high gauge, and they can settle, calm, idle almost, and rest. So we can rest while being active. And I lead a busy life, and when I'm busy, I do many, many patients in a day, and colleagues say, "How can you do that many people? How can you work quite so hard in a day?" We finish a day at the clinic and I start doing my own patient lists, and they say, "How do you have the energy for that?" But it's because I don't put much energy into it. It's very gentle, it's very calm actually, and it's very enjoyable. So we've got this, keeping the gears low, not over revving, letting our engines idle. And then we've got this idea of Sutherland, which I was talking about, which is about neutral. He would say that you can't really start a treatment on a patient without them being in neutral. And this neutral place where you're actually taking it out of gear. Now, you could say that taking someone out of gear is when their nervous systems aren't driving their physiology. So when that sympathetic drive cuts down, when our brains just gently quieten down and soften and breathe and relax, and actually, if we treat someone who has any kind of condition and their nervous systems are in hyperdrive, it's incredibly hard to treat them. So when I'm working, for example, when I work in London and people are rushing around and there's a lot of stimulation, it takes 10 minutes maybe for them to calm down, and you treat them until they find a point of neutral, a starting point of the treatment. Otherwise, the treatment is ineffective comparatively. Out in the country, or if you're working with children, they tend to be more in this state of neutral. I'll talk about this in more depth another time. But this sense of taking our brains out of gear and finding a quiet neutral. Now, there's very active ways of doing this, and I'll go through a little one at the end of this. But it's really important that our nervous system can find neutral, a sense of neutral. Otherwise, we won't sleep. And I'm going to do a whole podcast on sleep because it's obviously very, very important for our physiologies to rebalance and to process the previous day. And if we don't process the previous day physiologically and also neurally, it becomes harder for the next day. And so we start the day in a state of low-grade anxiety and stress, and we need to be rebalanced. But the only way to do that is to find a sense of quiet, neutral in our neurology before we go to sleep. So we've got idling, we've got low gears, we've got neutral. We also are going to talk about the oiling, the nutrition, the exercise, the rest, and other elements of self-care in terms of emotional and spiritual. In order for our engines, which is our bodies and our physiologies, to maintain their function, we have to do these things. These are not just luxuries. These are prerequisites to a life, to a healthy life. Because if you're physiologically in a state of duress or stress, it's going to have an effect. For example, you have too much stress hormones like cortisol in the body, and it directly suppresses immune function. It's physiological, it's real. It's not just, stress actually makes you ill. It can, and we have to find active ways of rebalancing ourselves, nurturing ourselves, and finding a sense of quiet, and developing a practice, and learning how to play again and be like children. That's a very important one. We'll do something on that as well. But for now, we'll just talk about one simple way to find a sense of quiet neutral. So just sit quietly and sit comfortably. Feel your feet on the floor and tune into a softness or quietness that's in your breathing and in your breath. And just allow your mind to do whatever it's doing, comes and goes, messes around, does stuff, tells you things. Fine. Allow all those things to come, but bring your awareness back to this quietness that's in your breathing. And keep allowing whatever comes up, but feel the softness in your breath. Don't judge it, just let it be. Just meet something soft, delicate, or quiet in your breath, and that tends to just quieten things down. And as things quieten down slowly, underneath the noise, there is a quiet, a stillness that's in you, and it's always there. And that quiet is your neutral place. And in order to refine ourselves and be true to ourselves, and not react to life, we need to come back to this quiet as much as we can. And that's our starting point. Okay, we'll build on this. I wish you well.